You guys remember BabyPorter, right? Well, how about that joke deck that actually turned out to be good that I called Smelly Dragon? Well, smash them both together and put some barcodes on the cards, because that's what this is. We're talking Expedition Gengar, which has the 3 energy attack, Hide in Shadows, where you're going to deal 40 damage, and then you're going to teleport Gengar right onto your bench and move a benched Pokemon into the active slot. While Gengar is safe on the bench, what Pokemon is better to move into the active position to sponge up some damage than a big fat Chansey? It's got 100 HP, a weakness that you're not going to see very often, and you can attach Metal Energy to it. Yeah baby, Metal Chansey's back. Let's just blend as many archetypes as we can into this one deck. Even tankier than a Metal Chansey, let's just go full-blown Metal Blissey. You get that added 20 HP, and Blissey can actually utilize those metal energies that are attached for its Poke Power Happy Healing. A nice way to sponge up even more damage by healing off damage that already exists on your bench Chanseys, Gengars, whatever. So Gengar teleports to the bench after attacking, you move in a big damage sponge in Blissey. Where do you go from there? Blissey's got a retreat cost of 2, you don't want to discard 2 metal energy to get Gengar back in the active position to attack with Hide in Shadows again. That's where Dragonite comes in. Its Tailwind Poke Power is going to make sure that whatever your active is, it's going to retreat for free, meaning that getting Gengar back in the active position is going to be pretty easy, just so you can attack, port back to the bench, soak up some damage, retreat, attack, port to the bench, soak some damage, retreat. You get the cycle. It's an amazing feeling gameplay loop once you get that set up, but yeah, it's going to take some setup. That's okay though, because early game you want to willingly sacrifice some Pokemon anyway to let your opponent think that they have the advantage before your loop gets fully set up and you have the extra tool, Gengar's Chaos Move Poke Power, at your disposal. If your opponent has taken 3 or more prizes, then you can use this power, which is essentially damage swap, but for the entire playing field. You can move damage counters from any one Pokemon, yours or your opponent's, to any other Pokemon, yours or your opponent's, giving you another way to remove damage from your sponges, but also use that damage against your opponent to hopefully score some cheap knockouts or at least stack some damage for future KOs. That's the overall strategy. You now know the Pokemon and the mechanics involved. Let's get into the details with the deck list. In a very rare occurrence, I've actually chosen to go with the 40 HP basic rather than the 50 HP basic with this Expedition Ghastly. The reason being that the Sky Ridge ones were too expensive for me. And the difference isn't all that big. I do prefer having that little buffer of 10 HP, but you use what you got, and in this case I had the Expedition ones. We're going to be running overall a 3-3-3 line of Gengar, and in this case I did have the Sky Ridge Haunters, and I do think as a middle evolution that this Haunter is preferable. We can talk about the merits of the other Haunter in the discussion at the end of the video. I just feel that this Sky Ridge one is a better turn 2 drop than the other one. Now of course your turn 3 is hopefully going to be Gengar. That way you can start firing off Hide in Shadows. There's really no reason you should be attaching any energy to Dratini or Chansey early game. If you are, then you have started the game in an unfavorable position. The deck can accommodate those opening hands where you don't have access to a Ghastly. So as I stated in the intro, don't worry too much about sacrificing a Dratini or, a Chansey early on, letting it just sponge a bunch of damage and get knocked out, because you're only helping Gengar in the late game. Just lull your opponent into a false sense of comfort. Let them think that they've got this game under control, that their setup is enough, and then you just come in and sweep later on with a gameplay cycle that they can't do much about. The Dragonite line is going to be a 2-2-2. The energy costs of Dratini and Dragonair make it pretty difficult to start a game with them and actually try to do some damage. Even more so with Dragonite, this thing is just going to sit on your bench. Hopefully you never have to resort to a Dragon Tail. If you are in that position, then either scoop or just use Dragonite as a stall method while it sponges up damage, and you can figure out what else you can do with your deck. A full playset of Chansey in this deck to ensure that you do have one late game. Ideally you start the game with a Chansey, just to soak up some damage in the active position, deal with whatever your opponent's early game setup is, while you spend the first few turns getting Ghastlies onto the bench, evolving up into Gengars, getting a Dragonite onto the bench, and making sure that that Gengar has 3 energy on it. Only 1 copy of Blissey. The original deck list I have for this had 2 Blissey in it, but what I found was whenever I wanted to use Blissey's Pokemon power, only 1 Blissey would have energy on it anyway, so there was really no point of having 2 in play. It really just worked better for me to stack the metal energy onto 1 Blissey and make it a wall. That way its Pokemon power was healing more damage on my benched Pokemon. And you don't want to do too much healing because you do want some spare damage counters here and there so that in the late game you can move those over to your opponent's Pokemon with Gengar's power. We'll be using the staple search and draw supporters, 4 copies of Pokemon Fan Club to help you search out those basic Pokemon, 4 copies of Professor Elm's training method to help you search out those evolution cards, 3 copies of Professor Oak's research for drawing off the top, and 3 copies of Underground Expedition for drawing off the bottom. Just to draw out the extra salt from your opponent, you're also going to chuck in a full playset of Pokemon Nurse so that any of the Chanseys you have in play that don't have any energy attached, that have just been soaking up damage in the active position, well, you can just fully heal it. And it's ready to go, and your opponent doesn't have a chance at knocking it out, or even for a future knockout really with 100 HP. And if they do have a Pokemon that can deal over 100 HP in a single turn, they're probably going to be using an attack that uses 4 energy, so we're going to run 4 copies of energy removal too, just to try to knock some of those off and stall out that occurrence as much as possible. This deck has a lot going on as far as the gameplay loop, but also stalling and sponging damage, while also disrupting your opponent, not just with energy removal, but also with Gengar's Chaos move, making your opponent question how they want to allocate damage across your Pokemon, because that's damage that could end up back on their side of the field. A full playset of Metal Energy, which is going to make your Chansey and your Blissey tankier. More specifically, you're going to want to stack these on your Blissey. That just makes more sense, especially if you're going to be using Pokemon Nurse mainly on your Chanseys. You don't want to waste any energy on those. A full playset of Rainbow Energy can help you attack with Dratini or Dragonair if you really need to, but they're mainly in here as a way to add extra damage counters onto Pokemon so that you can just move that damage counter over with Gengar's Chaos move. A couple copies of Warp Energy are going to serve as backups where if you can't get a Dragonite into play right away, or if the only Dragonite you had on your bench has just been knocked out somehow, or just in the early game if you've got a Gengar fully set up and you need the Chansey out of the active position but you just have a Dragonair on the bench, you're just waiting next turn so that you can play your Professor Elm and get the Dragonite, you can just attach a Warp Energy, get the Chansey onto the bench, and get your strategy going without having to wait. Rest of the deck, Psychic Energy. Let's start by talking about alts. So, Ghastly from Skyridge, I like better. In retrospect, I wish I would have gotten 3 copies to use in this deck instead, but it's okay. Ideally, you're not starting the game with a Ghastly anyway, but it is nice having that extra 10 HP cushion. Its attack, Haunt, does work pretty well with what Gengar's trying to do in the late game, so there's some synergy there. As for the alternate Haunter from Expedition, it doesn't really vibe very well with what this deck is trying to do, because Dream Eater is an attack that you're going to be using on turn 3. Hopefully on turn 3, you've got a Gengar in play, and you can attack with a better, more consistent attack. This Haunter seems like it's built more for like a sleep-centered Haymaker deck. But if you really wanted to use it, if you dig on the artwork or something, Nightmare isn't a bad turn 2 attack to have before you move up into Gengar, even though ideally you don't want to have a Haunter in the active at that point in the game. If you really wanted to beef up your Gengar line into something like a 4-4-4 stack, then you could include 1 copy of Skyridge Gengar in there, just so you can capitalize on its Pokemon power Manipulate, which is basically a free revive. It's going to allow you to get a Chansey out of your discard pile and put it straight back onto your bench. Or maybe even a Ghastly with some Psychic Energy attached to it, because you are able to attach some energy based on coin flips. You're not going to be attacking with it though, just because the Expedition Gengar has a better attack, and the name of this attack bugs the hell out of me because it's Hydrokinesis, meaning that you can control water with your mind, but you are either going to burn or confuse your opponent. Was the translation actually Pyrokinesis, but for censoring purposes, they didn't want to have Pyro on a card? If somebody has an answer for this, let me know down in the comments. It may be something as stupid as, oh, the Gengar is actually manipulating scalding water. That's what it is. Speaking of, this deck does struggle against your big fire archetypes just because they deal damage in such big chunks that it makes it difficult to sponge against them. They're almost always going to two-hit a Chansey, so it doesn't give you a whole lot of time to heal it up. And in the case of Charizard, it's just going to OHKO everything in the deck, so there is no sponge. And Charizard can sponge up a lot of damage itself with 120 HP. And then there's Aquapolis Umbreon, which doesn't necessarily shut down the entire gameplay loop, but it considerably slows it down since you're not able to use Dragonite's power to give free retreat to your active, meaning that those Chanseys are definitely going to sponge damage. They're going to stay there until they're knocked out most of the time. But Blissey won't be able to heal from the bench, Gengar won't be able to move damage counters from the bench. Matches against Umbreon are a struggle. Other than those, Gengar has a pretty good matchup against most other big archetypes. Mirror matches can drag on for a bit long, so if you are going up against another Gengar build, maybe consider putting in some gusting options. That way your opponent's Gengars aren't safe on the bench. You can pull them right back into the active position and knock out their lead attackers. Or even just pull a Dragonite into the active position and give it a special condition, or just start stacking damage on it. Whatever floats your boat and feeds the goat. Let me know down in the comments what you think about this build, what you think about these Gengars and any experiences you've had with them. This Gengar sprite looks really good with the purple playmat. It's like it's phasing right up through the table. Social media links are in the description. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you next video.